Luther Tikhonowicz here. I'm going to introduce the idea of stereotype threat. To do that, first I want to talk about the idea of stereotypes generally. Stereotypes are connections between various ideas that allow you to rapidly judge how the world works. They're closely related to what we're trying to do as teachers. We're trying to develop in students understanding of how the world works. But several of them are quite negative when we associate with generally something that's immediately visible about an individual, their ethnicity, race, etc., gender, etc., some aspect of their cognitive ability or aptitude. There's lots of negative effects here. There is the idea of various biases, which come in several flavors. We have straight up bigotry. We have this implicit bias, which tends to show up. You will tend to act biased even if you aren't bigoted. You'll tend to act in a way that confirms stereotypes unless you consciously try to do something different. There's also a pigeonhole bias, where people will tend to place themselves or place others in a location the stereotype says they belong, change their opportunities and understanding of the environment around them. So there's all different kinds of biases that exist. There's imposter syndromes, where you'll tend to feel that if you're in a minority group, you will have a much stronger chance of feeling like you don't belong, that other people in your field are better than you, even if in fact you are the best. And there's many more we could talk about. I'm bringing these up not because I'm going to talk about them in this module, but because I want to point out some of the things I'm not discussing. In particular, we're discussing something called stereotype threat. Let me contrast that with all of these others by describing briefly how stereotype threat works. Stereotype threat depends on three things, right? So if you are aware of a stereotype about you, I should say a negative stereotype. Okay, so if you're aware of a stereotype that says people like you are going to do poorly, then your performance is reduced. You're threatened by this and you perform less. Notably, this does not include belief. It actually doesn't matter, particularly in many of the studies, whether you believe the stereotype or not. It's, are you aware? Is it a negative stereotype? Is it about you or people like you? Right? Do you identify with it in some fashion? Then you're going to perform less. Let's briefly give an idea of why this might be the case before we move on and talk about some of the studies that have shown it does indeed exist. In your brain, very roughly, there are lots of different, let's say subroutines, modules, actors, whatever you want to call them. Lots of little pieces of your brain that turn ideas into other ideas and process a lot of information for you, help you understand the world, and building new ones of those is what we do as educators. But there's also in your conscious brain where you actually do most of your thinking, the you part of your brain, if you will. That portion of your brain acts like a processor that has just a few registers, commonly identified as three things it can remember, three ideas you can actually think with at a time, supplied to you by the rest of the brain. Now, in a normal learning environment, most people will spend a reasonable subset of that understanding what's going on. Okay? Thinking about and understanding the instruction they are being given. And they'll spend some amount of it learning. By learning, I mean creating new little subprocessors in the subconscious region of the brain that will internalize and make automatic the information being created. However, this changes if you're aware of a stereotype. Okay, so if stereotype threat is operating and you believe it, then that suggests you are disadvantaged, causing a fear of unfair failure. That fear of unfair failure can cause stress. One of my favorite definitions of stress is wasting time thinking about how stressed you are. Okay? That is something that's conscious. It's in the mind. It occupies some of this working thought. And so one of these slots needs to be removed. Typically, that will go into the learning one. Although it could go into the understanding one. If it goes into the learning one, we just don't learn as quickly or well. We don't develop that new information. And if it goes into the understanding, then we learn incorrectly, right? We're not as good at what we're doing. Okay? It's possible the instruction could be easier and this isn't as much of an issue, but for most instruction, we try to sort of pitch it at a state where most students' brains are fully engaged most of the time. And with stereotype threat, if you believe it, you have this extra stress. How about if you don't believe it? If you don't believe, then there is this fear of confirmation. Okay? If you are the sole or one of the few representatives of your group in whatever is going on, and you do poorly, then there's this fear that people will assume people like you can't do this well. Right? If you're in the majority, people just say, oh, that one person had a bad day, didn't do well, isn't good at this. But if you're in the minority, people will say, oh, people like you can't do well. And you're aware of this, it causes this fear of confirmation, which causes stress. And so we end up in essentially the same position, a different mechanism for getting there, but we are still in the situation where your brain is occupied by this stress instead of by the task at hand, which will limit your performance. This is the concept, one model of why a stereotype threat works. Now, this is hard to verify this is really what's going on. Peeking inside the brain is a tricky thing. But it is relatively easy to verify that this exists, that there is a real force here. This is one of the papers that pointed out that the awareness was really key. What this paper, they took black and white participants, and they split them into two groups. One group, they told that the game of golf they were engaged in was about natural athletic ability. The other group, they said it was about sports intelligence, trying to play off of stereotypes about race and athletic ability versus cognitive ability. And what they found is doing nothing different between the two groups besides telling them that it was one or the other, giving them the same course, the same environment to work in. They found this dramatic difference, about a 20% difference in the score between the people that were in a mixed race group and their race was stereotypically good at what they were told they were doing versus they were stereotypically bad at what they were told they were doing. So this is an evidence that awareness is what matters. But it doesn't, however, point out another aspect of stereotype threat, which is that it's a negative force as opposed to a positive force, right? This study alone could suggest that it was a boost instead of a threat. However, about 10 years later in 2008, there was another paper. This is the beginning of that paper. And one of the graphs in that paper really demonstrates clearly that it is indeed a threatening situation. In this particular case, they took high school calculus students. They gave them a test of calculus. And some of them, they did nothing unusual about the test, like every other test. So the stereotype threat here is sort of the normal condition. They did nothing in particular. And another group, they intervened to try to reduce the stereotype threat. And we'll talk about some of those interventions in some of the later videos of this module. But what they found was in the normal situation and in the intervention situation, the males did the same. Whether the stereotype threat was there or not didn't matter to them because they were not the stereotypically threatened group on this particular exercise. The other thing they found is the females did dramatically better than the males when the stereotype threat was removed. And the reason we see this great jump is because there was an entrance barrier. Okay? This was a calculus class in high school, so people only got into this if they had done well in the previous math classes. But all through high school and even before, the stereotypes about males and females in math had been present in all of their minds. So although all of the students entered at the same level of practical ability, the females entered at that level of ability operating under stereotype threat, and the males entered that level of ability without it. So when the stereotype threat was removed, the females had more of their conscious brain available. We saw that the amount they had learned was actually superior. And this entrance barrier combined with stereotype threat had caused this unbalanced situation. So this is an example. These are a couple of the studies that show us what we mean by stereotype threat. If you're aware of a stereotype that's negative about you, then you will have reduced performance, whether or not you believe it, and independent of all of those sorts of biases and other forces from the outside. So in our coming videos in this module, we'll explore various ways of combating this. But that is a summary of stereotype threat.